I'm born and raised in Baltimore City. For the longest time, I had my own stigma about what Baltimore represented. Growing up in the inner city of Baltimore has its challenges. I was raised in all of the neighborhoods that they've glorified shows on, like The Corner and the Wire. But there's also other sides of Baltimore that people are not even aware of. So it took me to start traveling abroad to really start appreciating what Baltimore has to offer and what Baltimore prepped me for as I started my career. So I started here at Mount Royal Elementary. I went to Utah Elementary. Then I went to Liberty Elementary. That tells you how I jumped around for a while. All through that time, teachers always kind of knew I had a gift, but they really weren't applauding it. It was just something that separated me from the other kids. My parents, I am the son of a teenage parent that gave up his dream of being an artist to take care of me. And that was my dad and my mom. They were both 16 when they had me. So my dad was an artist, but he was very, very frustrated because at that time there was no outlet for artists. And so rather than probably being as nurturing as he could be with regard to my talent, I think that in his mind he thought he was trying to persuade me not to do it so that I wouldn't have the same disappointments he did. And so as a young child, I often saw him maybe not nurture the arts like he could have, but he was such a champion in the latter part of my career. So I talk about that because in the beginning stages, you know, here I was, you got guns being shot, you got drugs going on, you got all kinds of stuff that's happening in the community, and I was that kid that always kind of stayed around the house and drew. So art saved my life several times. Most of the kids that I grew up with, they're either dead or in jail. And you hear a lot of people say that in Baltimore. It becomes like a cliche statement that you say, but for me it's very, very true. When I look back at the people I grew up with, it's something that happens to African-American males in this city. So when I look at the fact that I always believed in being an artist, my mom applauded me being an artist. My dad was proud that I was an artist. Children in Baltimore need to understand that they have that same outlet. Because from there, I went to Garrison Middle School. And along the way, I ran into 3 male mentors that was instrumental in me being who I am today. David Humphreys was the first teacher that looked at me in junior high school and said, hey son, you need to stop playing, running up and down the halls, and think about doing your talent. And so what he did was he would punish me when he caught me in the hallways, and he would make me come to his class and do stuff for the school. So after a while I started realizing, wow, so I can show off and still get rewarded. It was kind of backwards, but at some point, something happened to me where I began to realize that I could apply my art to something else. Always got fairly good grades. My attention span was that big, but I understood why it was that big because I was a creative, spirited kid. So a lot of times now in school, when you talk to children, they all, everybody's getting Ritalin. They're talking about how kids had ADD and all. I probably would have been labeled with all that stuff when I was in school, but the biggest thing is I didn't have an outlet to do it. So David Humphreys was instrumental in making me start taking it seriously. And just before I went to high school, I began to understand the discipline side of art. And when I got to Carver, I met the man who was really, I attribute my success totally to him. And his name is Chanel Alford. He was my high school art teacher at Carver Vocational Technical High School. In this city, there were a couple of schools where you went where you could learn a trade and not have to be concerned about working for corporate America. They actually bred us to be entrepreneurs. So it had everything. They had bricklaying, they had food service. I took commercial art. My dad also went to Carver. He attended Carver, and he took printing. Through his frustration of trying to do art, he transitioned into printing so that he could take care of his family. In the midst of doing printing, he ended up at the Afro newspaper as a linotype operator and as pressman. So he did that for several years before a lot of African-American men were doing this. So he can tell you all kinds of, so he passed away 3 years ago, of how the color lines were even alive, even in Baltimore at that time. I'm sitting here now at the Walters Museum, which came about in 1932. And I think the BMA came about in 1912. But by the time I got to college, you're talking about the Maryland Institute's been around since the 1800s. So when you think about that, there's a legacy of art happening right in our backyard, and most of us are totally oblivious to it. As a child, I've been in this building, I've been in the BMA building, and I would walk the halls. And even at college, because I actually, at Carver, they taught me a trade. I was the first 10th grader to get awarded work study at Carver, which was a landmark situation for me because they had never taken the chance on giving work study to a 10th grader before. And so our program was basically you learn lettering, you learn design, and then in the 12th grade, after you learn those skills, you would be put into work study. Well, I learned it in 3 months. So they actually tried to put me into work study that first year, which changed my life because I ended up being assigned to a gentleman named Jerome Washington who had a sign company. And so here I was at 14, where my other guys was on the street acting stupid, and I was able to make money from a trade that I had learned all throughout. And so that is a powerful testament right there of what mentorship is, because without these guys, I would have been on the street. And if you notice, each one of those people were males. They were dominant males. You always hear stories of where males are and aren't in our society, but without those mentors, I don't know where I would be today, to be very, very honest with you, because it was so many things happening faster than what was happening in my world. So Carver really prepped me for the Maryland Institute, which I attended, because at graduation, I didn't know that I was going to receive these scholarships to the Maryland Institute. Matter of fact, to be honest, I was so ignorant, I didn't even know what a scholarship was. I thought it meant that you had room and board and all kinds of other stuff. I didn't know that there was a limitation on it. So where I had figured I wasn't going to go to college, I was going to open up a sign shop and I was just going to, do my business. I took a chance and I went to the Maryland Institute, which really kind of changed my life. But at the same time, I went to all black schools through all of my undergrad years. I mean, we're talking about my high school and middle school and elementary. And so here I was in an environment that was totally opposite in my own city. So how can you become an alien in your own city? But it was a good education for me because it actually set me up to really start thinking about pursuing art as a career. Because at that point, it was a hustle for me, but I hadn't really looked at it as a... So if you can imagine, the guys on the street was hustling drugs and all kinds of other stuff. And here I had learned how to hustle art. I would go door to door asking business owners if they needed signs done. And sometimes I would even say, hey, man, I can't read your sign. I can send somebody back tomorrow. They can fix that. And I would show up the next day with my lettering brushes. So the notion of making a living from art for me was never really a question because of how I was indoctrinated here in Baltimore and through my education here. So that part I really had made me reevaluate Baltimore because I had my own feelings about Baltimore. It was sometimes a very dark place, and the opportunities seemed to be very minimal. And I watched all the males in my society who were having all kinds of struggles just trying to be recognized for what they were trying to do, and they didn't have a lot of outlets. I watched my father's own frustration with that. So another thing that happened was my dad, he was working for the printing industry, and they were looking for vocational teachers. So he had an opportunity to go and teach. So my dad actually taught in the Baltimore City school system for 30 years before he retired. And but that also introduced me to, okay, well, it's time to give back, maybe educating, mentorship, that whole thing. If it wasn't for those guys, I don't know where I would be, stuck with me. So even in college, I was going back to high school to speak to children. Today, I spend a lot of time speaking to professional artists, amateur artists. It's so important for us to really educate people on the importance of art, because right now, if you talk about all of the programs in the city being actually diminished, it's a really spooky time right now when you think about it. I mean, where are kids going to get this kind of information if you're saying here in the 21st century that the majority of the public schools in Baltimore City don't have art anymore? And even the one school that I'm most proud of, which is Carver Vocational Technical High School, no longer has an art program. I mean, can you imagine that? That they had a legacy of creating art entrepreneurs. So now you got to go to, and thank God we got the School for the Arts. Thank God we got Carver Center out in Towson, which are still two very, very good programs. But when you look at Baltimore and the legacy of this museum and other museums, and now we got Reginald Lewis and all these other things happening, it's like we really got to really question where our priorities are. You know, when I see the Walters now beginning to do community outreach, for us to come in and feel a part of this is very, very important. Like we'll come to an exhibition here and complain because African American artists aren't being represented here, but then we don't come here, you know. And so when you come, it makes them start to cater to what you want. We have more voice than we think. Our voice has now come outside of Black History Month, when most of the museums all over the country, not this institution, put our work out for Black History Month because we're all sensitized and proud to be Black at that period for some reason. And the world feels comfortable talking about it around that time. But I'm glad that institutions like this are beginning to move it outside of February and do more and more for folks to understand what's happening with arts in this community. Because to me, that's what's really important. So going to the Maryland Institute really altered my perspective about my career and what Baltimore represented to me. Because when I came out of college, I didn't have any outlets. I still couldn't find a gallery to host my work. The museums didn't have a lot of programs going on that I could become a part of. That made it very, very difficult for me to figure out what I wanted to do. So thankfully, being an entrepreneur and being taught to be an entrepreneur in high school was what fueled me through. You know, even today when we talk about the arts in relationship to Baltimore, we have Artscape, which is one of the largest art festivals in the country, in this region. And even African American artists have a hard time getting in that show. And a lot of people don't know that, but I'm here to tell you that that exists. I'm here to tell you that when you start talking about art, there are disparities even in art. You know, I'm proud that the Walters thought that I could have a voice to artists and talk about my connection to Baltimore. But in order to really talk about that, I have to start and be honest about what's available to us, you know. When I came out of the Maryland Institute, I didn't know what I was going to do. Every portfolio review I went to, people flipped through the book and stared in my face and basically said they would call me another time. So when I got out of school, here you get all this education and you don't even have an outlet. So here I am starting to rewind to my father's existence as an artist, not having an outlet. And here I was with all this quote unquote talent, not having an outlet. So thank God a couple things happened with us to really change that. If you can think back to when the Cosby Show came on in the 80s, that was a major revolutionary period for a lot of African American artists, because suddenly the Huxtables had this house. They were both professional beings. They had their house all suited up, and suddenly we looked at the show and wanted some of that same stuff in our home, you know. And why it was pivotal was because technology had shifted to the point where it was accessible. If you wanted to go to find where that piece that was on Claire Huxtable's wall, you could go to the mall and actually get it. Because this same revolution would have happened in the 70s when Good Times was on TV, where Ernie Barnes' work was on the set. Everybody saw the work, but the difference was we didn't have a clue where to get it. And because technology was where it wasn't readily accessible. So when I talk about all those things and the disparities of artists in this community, technology was the one savior of all of that. And because suddenly now there was a feeding frenzy on art. And I came along just when that opening was happening. So I was able to start doing works that, my early work was comic books and science fiction, fantasy, all these things that had nothing to do with me. You know what I mean? And so it was nice for me to be able to start shifting and doing works that were positive reflections of who we are. And for the last 30 years, I've been spending a lot of time devoting myself to doing images that are positive about us, but also going to nonprofit organizations and appealing to them to document their efforts through art and using that for fundraising, which has been a really great thing. So I say all that to say that this is a powerful time that we're in. Just having a conversation with an artist earlier. We're at a time now where if you are a poet, if you're a writer, if you're any kind of visionary, you can now broadcast yourself. YouTube, you got phones with video cameras and cameras, you walk around with it. I mean, you got a whole media outlet now that really wasn't available before. And so if you're an artist now and you're having problems being recognized, something might be wrong with you. It might not be the world against you all of a sudden. So I think this is an exciting time for anybody that's a creative person, an artist of any walk of life, because if you use that time wisely, if you use those things that are available to us, it's amazing the message you can have with your work. So I'm going to talk a little bit more on this subject, but I'm glad that everybody took the time to come out to the Walters to participate in this event, and I'll talk more about my existence here in Baltimore.